For 10,000 years, the Imperium has prayed to a corpse that still dreams, and the moment those dreams end, the galaxy itself may finally scream. The Golden Throne had never been silent. It groaned with the weight of impossible machinery, whispered with the crackle of failing archaeotech, and screamed constantly within the immaterium, where 1,000 souls a day were burned to keep one light alive. Yet on this cycle, deep beneath the Himalayan massif, something changed. Not a sound, not an alarm, but a pressure, subtle and immense, like the shift of a continental plate beneath reality itself. Rabaut Guilliman felt it first. Across the void, amid the endless labor of the Indomitus Crusade, the Lord Commander of the Imperium paused mid-stride. Data slates slipped from trembling hands. Strategium officers watched in silence as the Primarch of the Ultramarines slowly straightened, his eyes unfocusing as if fixed on something infinitely distant. Guilliman had lived with the psychic absence of his father for centuries since his resurrection, a vast, cold sun behind a wall of agony and static. Now that absence thinned. On Terra, the Adeptus Custodes reacted without conscious thought. Guardians bred for a single purpose stiffened as one, auramite armor humming faintly. Some fell to one knee. Others stood frozen, every instinct screaming a truth they had never dared imagine. Within the Sanctum Imperialis, the air grew heavy, saturated with ozone and sanctified incense, as the Emperor of mankind drew something like a breath. The Astronomonicon flared. Across the galaxy, navigators howled as the guiding beacon of humanity burned not brighter, but sharper. Where once it had been a roaring, barely contained inferno of will, it now possessed direction, edges, intent. Warp storms recoiled as if burned. Demons shrieked and scattered, their forms unraveling under a pressure that was no longer merely sustaining, but watching. On the Golden Throne, desiccated flesh twitched. The Emperor's body had been a ruin for 10 millennia, sustained only by the throne's agony engines and the constant sacrifice of psychers fed into its hunger. His form was skeletal, skin drawn tight as parchment over bone, eyes sealed, mouth locked in a rictus of eternal pain. But beneath that ruin, beneath the dead flesh and shattered nerves, the mind that had conquered old Earth, broken gods, and bound the warp itself began to surface from an ocean of torment. Awareness returned not gently, but like a blade dragged across the soul. He felt everything. Every war fought in his name, every lie spoken in reverence, every cathedral raised upon worlds that burned because of his absence. He felt the ecclesiarchy's worship, thick and suffocating, pressing against him like chains. He felt the fractured remnants of his grand design, the Imperium, bloated, cruel, rotting, yet still defiant in the face of extinction. And he felt Guilliman. The psychic connection snapped into place with devastating clarity. Father and son, divided by death, time, and failure, touched minds across the immaterium. Guilliman staggered, dropping to one knee as a presence more vast than any god he had ever defied flooded his thoughts. Not words, not yet, only judgment, sorrow, and a burning, inexorable will. Within the warp, the ruinous powers noticed. Tzeentch's labyrinthian schemes shuddered as futures once certain dissolved into screaming impossibilities. Nurgle's gardens withered in patches as something inimical to entropy itself pushed back. Khorne roared in rage, sensing a war yet to come that would drown reality in blood. Even Slaanesh recoiled, sensing denial, control, and anathema to excess and surrender. For the first time since the Horus Heresy, Chaos felt fear, untainted by arrogance. Back on Terra, the Emperor's eyes opened.
They did not blaze with light. They did not cast down miracles. They simply focused. And in that focus was the weight of an intellect that had once planned for humanity's ascension beyond gods and warp alike. The Golden Throne screamed as systems never meant to sustain consciousness strained under renewed command. Power conduits burst. Servitors died instantly as psychic feedback scoured their minds clean. The Emperor of mankind was awake. Not restored, not healed, awake within a broken body, chained to a throne of suffering, ruling an empire that had become everything he had tried to prevent. He understood in an instant that standing would mean annihilation, of Terra, of the Astronomicon, perhaps of humanity itself. So he remained seated, still crucified by machinery, and began to think. Plans unfolded at speeds no mortal mind could follow. The Imperium did not need salvation, it needed correction. Guilliman would be his hand for now, the Custodes his shield. The faith of trillions would be tolerated, then reshaped or burned away. And beyond it all lay the final, terrible truth he could no longer ignore. The warp itself would have to be confronted, not endured, not bargained with, but mastered or unmade. The galaxy had not been ready for his return, but readiness had never been a requirement.
The first command the Emperor issued was not spoken aloud. It did not travel through vox channels or echo through cathedral halls. It moved through the warp itself, a precise and deliberate exertion of will that reshaped currents long left to chaos and entropy. Across Terra, astropaths collapsed as the psychic pressure shifted from a constant scream into a focused, unbearable clarity. Many died instantly, their minds burned clean as candles before a sun. Others survived, weeping blood as they realized the impossible truth before any proclamation could confirm it. The Emperor was no longer merely enduring, he was acting. Within the Sanctum Imperialis, the Adeptus Custodes sealed every threshold. Auramite boots rang against ancient stone as formations locked into positions practiced only in theoretical drills, rituals never meant to be enacted. Their gene-crafted instincts screamed vigilance, yet beneath that was something older and far more dangerous: recognition. They had been made to guard a god who denied divinity, and now that god watched the galaxy again through mortal eyes. The Golden Throne resisted him. Its mechanisms had been designed to imprison, not empower. Over 10,000 years, layers of crude dogma and desperate modification had transformed it into a cage of suffering, dependent on ritual sacrifice rather than elegant control. The Emperor felt the souls fed into it each day, their fear and devotion dissolving into raw fuel. He allowed the process to continue, for now. Ending it abruptly would collapse the Astronomicon, strand humanity's fleets, and fracture the Imperium beyond repair. The calculus of survival demanded patience. Beyond the walls of the Imperial Palace, Terra trembled. Seismic sensors detected minute vibrations beneath the crust, not from tectonic movement, but from warp pressure bleeding into reality. Above the planet, the void itself appeared strained, stars shimmering as if seen through disturbed water. The Astronomicon's beam sharpened further, cutting a precise, merciless line through the immaterium. Warp predators fled its path. Navigation routes thought lost for millennia reappeared, suddenly viable, their madness scoured away by directed psychic force. On distant worlds, the effects were no less profound. In the Eye of Terror, demon worlds screamed. Reality buckled as ancient bindings flared to life, wards laid down during the Great Crusade reactivating with terrifying efficacy. Within the Black Legion, Abaddon felt the shift like a blade pressing against his throat. Not pain, warning. The War Master of Chaos did not flinch, but the certainty that had guided his long war fractured. For the first time since Horus fell, the future refused to resolve into victory or ruin. It simply watched him back.
Within the warp's shifting madness, the Emperor turned his attention outward. He did not rage, he did not mourn, he assessed. The great rift had split the galaxy in half, a wound screaming defiance at his long silence. The Imperium Nihilus burned in isolation, preyed upon by Xenos and warp spawn alike. Guilliman's crusade fought with admirable discipline, yet it was a response, not a solution. The Emperor understood now what his long imprisonment had made inevitable. Humanity had learned to survive without him, but it had not learned to ascend. Faith had replaced understanding, dogma had smothered reason. The imperial truth lay in fragments, buried beneath incense and fear. The Emperor felt the ecclesiarchy's vast psychic weight pressing against his consciousness, billions of minds believing, worshipping, pleading. Their devotion sustained him in ways he despised and yet could not entirely reject. Belief had power. Denying that truth was one of his greatest errors. Guilliman received the second touch not as a flood, but as structure. Thoughts aligned within his mind, precise and unbearable in their clarity. The Emperor did not speak in commands, nor in the familiar cadence of a father addressing a son. Instead, Guilliman experienced intention, strategic vectors, priorities, dangers yet unseen. He saw the Imperium as the Emperor saw it, not as a realm to be ruled, but as a weapon to be reforged. Guilliman wept without sound, not from joy, from understanding, from the knowledge that the Imperium he had tried to save was only the foundation for something harsher, colder, and far more necessary. He rose from his knees slowly, spine straightening under a weight that would have crushed any lesser being. When his eyes opened, they carried a resolve that even his officers could sense without explanation. Orders followed. Entire crusade fleets altered course without debate. Forge worlds received encrypted data visions that sent their arch-magi into terrified reverence and furious calculation. The Custodes began preparations unseen since the days before Ulanor, ancient arsenals unlocking at the Emperor's silent authorization. Hidden bastions across the Sol system powered up, their existence known only to the master of mankind and the gene sons he no longer fully trusted. In the warp, the ruinous powers reacted with escalating violence. Demonic incursions spiked across 100 sectors as chaos sought to overwhelm the galaxy before the Emperor could fully reassert his will. Cult uprisings flared spontaneously, prophets screaming of a false dawn, of a tyrant god awakening to chain reality once more. Worlds burned as reaction outpaced reason. The Emperor observed it all without hesitation. He had not awakened to comfort humanity. He had awakened because extinction approached faster than even he had anticipated. The long war had reached its final phase, and subtlety now was a liability. If humanity was to survive what came next, it would need more than endurance. It would need transformation. And somewhere deep within the Golden Throne, amid pain older than empires, the Emperor began to prepare the galaxy for a truth it had been shielded from since the dawn of history. The gods of the warp were not eternal.
The Emperor turned his attention inward. For 10,000 years, his consciousness had been stretched thin across 1,000,000 battlefronts, shackled to the Astronomicon, holding back the warp's predation through sheer, unrelenting force. Awakening did not restore him. It reconnected him to the full extent of his own damage. Nerves long dead screamed as partial function returned. Muscles remembered purpose but could not obey. The Golden Throne translated agony into control and control into survival. He accepted the pain without resistance. Pain had never been an obstacle. It was merely information. What concerned him was decay. The systems sustaining him were failing in ways no tech priest truly understood. Layers of superstition had replaced maintenance. Ritual had overwritten logic. Components once designed to harmonize with his psychic signature now fought against it, feeding on belief and sacrifice rather than synchronization.
The throne had become a parasite as much as a prison, and removing it would detonate Terra like a dying star. So the Emperor adapted. Subtle alterations rippled through the throne's operation, minute recalibrations executed through thought alone. Power draw shifted, feedback loops dampened. For the first time since the siege of Terra, the throne responded rather than resisted. The change was slight but measurable. Psychers fed into the machinery burned more slowly. Some even survived long enough to understand what was happening before oblivion claimed them. Within the Imperium, this refinement sent shockwaves. The Astronomicon no longer simply burned, it searched. Its beam probed unstable regions, mapping currents, identifying weaknesses, exposing hidden passages once thought suicidal. Warp routes opened where none had existed, not through brute force, but through imposed order. Humanity's psychic footprint sharpened, no longer a beacon of desperation, but of intent. The Emperor felt another presence stir. Deep within the vaults beneath the imperial palace, sealed behind layers of wards predating the Imperium itself, ancient devices responded to his awakening. Weapons that had never fired, engines designed not to conquer space but to deny it, tools built during an age when humanity had dared to plan for victory over the warp itself. He had sealed them away when the heresy shattered his timetable. Now the time for patience had ended. The Custodes received no explanation, only certainty. Their dreams changed first. Where once they knew only vigilance and eternal readiness, now visions intruded, fractured images of impossible wars yet to come, of stars collapsing into silence, of humanity standing at the edge of something vast and final. None spoke of it, but every one of them felt the same truth settle into their gene-forged bones. Their purpose was expanding. Elsewhere, the Imperium reacted with fear. On shrine worlds, preachers declared miracles. On forge worlds, magi argued violently over corrupted data echoes and impossible readings. The High Lords of Terra convened in emergency session, their authority suddenly fragile beneath the presence they could feel but not command. Some wept in relief, others trembled, sensing judgment far terrible than death. The Emperor spared them no immediate thought. His focus shifted to the wound splitting the galaxy. The Great Rift was not merely a tear, it was a symptom, a pressure release from centuries of warp saturation, fed by war, belief, and unchecked psychic excess. Closing it would require more power than even he could safely exert from the throne, but stabilizing it, containing its spread, was possible. He began with denial. Across dozens of key systems, the warp recoiled as ancient psychic anchors activated. Lost pylons, forgotten null fields, remnants of technologies scavenged or misunderstood by later ages flared to life. Not enough to heal the galaxy, but enough to slow the bleeding. In Imperium Nihilis, isolated fleets felt it as sudden clarity, astropaths briefly able to scream messages across the void before silence returned. Guilliman felt the strain immediately. The Primarch understood the cost of what was being attempted. Resources would vanish, entire sectors would be sacrificed to buy time, worlds already condemned would not be saved. This was not the idealism of the Great Crusade reborn. This was triage on a galactic scale. Guilliman did not protest. He simply adjusted his strategies to match a vision far older and far colder than his own. In the warp, the gods answered containment with escalation. Demonic hosts hurled themselves against real space in suicidal waves, clawing for purchase before new boundaries locked them out. The Immaterium boiled with contradiction as the Emperor's will imposed rules where none should exist. For the first time in uncounted ages, chaos was forced to react rather than dictate. The Emperor noted this with grim satisfaction. He had no illusions of final victory, not yet. Awakening had bought humanity time, nothing more. But time was the one resource he had always known how to weaponize. As long as he endured, plans could unfold. As long as the throne held, the galaxy could be reshaped into something capable of surviving the storm to come. And beneath it all, buried under suffering and strategy alike, the Emperor acknowledged a truth he had once denied with absolute conviction. Humanity would never escape the warp by ignorance alone.
The Emperor shifted his perception beyond the Imperium's borders. For too long, humanity had measured the galaxy only by its own suffering, believing itself besieged by an endless tide of monsters and madness. Awakening allowed him to see the wider pattern again, not as a ruler bound to a single species, but as a strategist surveying a decaying board. Xenos' empire stirred uneasily as the warp's behavior changed, their ancient instincts sensing an imbalance they could neither name nor escape. On craft worlds drifting through the void, Eldar seers recoiled from visions that refused to resolve. Futures once mapped with cruel precision now collapsed into blinding uncertainty. The Emperor's presence in the warp was not domination, it was interference. Threads of fate snapped under his attention, denying even the Eldiari their fragile illusion of foresight. Some whispered that the Monkey god stirred. Others warned that something far worse than chaos had returned to the great game. In the depths of Kamara, the dark city shuddered. Its stolen suns flickered as hidden pathways through the webway became unstable. The Emperor did not reach for the Drukhari directly, yet his attempts to impose structure upon the warp pressed against the webway's wounded foundations. Ancient scars, left unhealed since the fall, began to ache. The Dark Eldar responded as they always had, with violence, but their raids grew more desperate, their excess sharpened by an unspoken fear. Even the Necrons took notice. Tomb worlds long dormant began to hum as null field sensors registered fluctuations no organic species could fully comprehend. The Silent King, wandering the void in exile, turned his gaze toward Terra for the first time in millennia. He recognized the signature immediately. Not psychic, not truly, something adjacent, something that sought to deny the warp through will alone rather than technology. It was an approach disturbingly close to his own ancient designs, and that troubled him more than any daemon incursion ever had. Back on Terra, the Emperor felt the cost of this expanded awareness. Each extension of his will tore at what remained of his mortal shell. The throne compensated, flooding him with energy ripped from sacrificed minds, but even that could not mask the truth forever. He was a mind operating far beyond the tolerances of its vessel. Sustained action on this scale would burn him completely out, leaving humanity blind and directionless once more. Limits were necessary. He withdrew his attention in measured increments, collapsing his focus back toward the Imperium's core. The astronomonic steadied, its sharpened beam holding firm rather than expanding further. Warp resistance stabilized. The galaxy exhaled, unaware how close it had come to catastrophic recalibration. This was not retreat, it was discipline. Within the Imperial Palace, a single custodian felt something unprecedented, instruction without command. Not an order, a suggestion, a vector of purpose that extended beyond standing guard. The Emperor began to seed initiative among those he trusted most, nudging actions rather than dictating them. He would not rule as he once had. Direct control had failed before. This time, he would shape outcomes indirectly, allowing strength to emerge where it proved worthy. Far away, Guilliman sensed this change instantly. The pressure eased, replaced by expectation.
The Emperor was not withdrawing from him, he was demanding growth. Gilliman understood that his role was no longer to preserve the Imperium as it was, but to prepare it for a future that might be unrecognizable to those alive today. The burden was staggering, yet clarifying. He had not been resurrected to be a relic, he was a transitional force. Chaos responded to this restraint with confusion. The ruinous powers had expected escalation, a return to open psychic warfare on a scale unseen since the heresy. Instead, they found themselves constrained by something more dangerous than brute force: refusal. The Emperor denied them reactions, denied them predictable opposition. Their attempts to provoke him resulted only in localized disasters, never the galaxy-spanning collapse they desired. This imbalance bred paranoia even among gods. Schemes cannibalized each other, alliances frayed. The warp churned not with unified purpose, but with internal contradiction. The Emperor observed this fragmentation closely, committing every reaction to memory. Chaos thrived on momentum. Starved of it, even gods could stumble. As the Chapter 1 drew toward its end, one truth became unavoidable. The Emperor's awakening had not begun a golden age, it had begun an audit. Every power, every lie, every assumption underpinning the galaxy was now being tested against an intellect that no longer slept. Survival would no longer be granted by faith or fury alone. It would be earned through adaptation. And as the master of mankind settled back into calculated stillness, the galaxy unknowingly crossed a threshold it could never retreat from. The throne breathed, and the future listened.
Change did not announce itself with proclamations. It crept through the Imperium as a shift in consequence, subtle at first, then impossible to ignore. Orders issued from Terra began to carry a weight that could not be traced to authority alone. They aligned too well with unfolding events, arriving before disasters fully manifested, redirecting fleets moments before annihilation. To the Administratum, it appeared as statistical anomaly. To the Inquisition, it felt like manipulation. To those who obeyed, it felt inevitable. The Emperor was no longer reacting to the Imperium's decay, he was using it. From the Golden Throne, he began to dismantle assumptions that had calcified over 10 millennia, not openly, not violently, but through pressure applied at precise points of failure. Entire tithing systems were quietly rewritten. Certain worlds were relieved of impossible demands, not out of mercy, but because their collapse would cascade into strategic ruin. Others were stripped to the bone without warning, their populations fed into war efforts they would never understand. Efficiency replaced tradition wherever survival demanded it. The High Lords sensed their irrelevance before it was formally revealed. They argued, schemed, and maneuvered as they always had, yet their decrees increasingly went unanswered. Naval deployments stalled until revised. Inquisitorial writs failed to unlock doors that had once opened instantly. Even the Adeptus Mechanicus encountered resistance, ancient seals denying access to vaults their own records insisted were theirs by right. Power was not being seized from them, it was simply bypassing them. Gilliman watched this transformation with grim clarity. He had spent years fighting the Imperium's inertia, believing reform could be achieved through structure and example. Now he saw the deeper truth. The system was too vast, too corrupted by survival mechanisms that no longer served survival. The Emperor did not seek to heal it, he sought to reforge it through stress, allowing only what endured to remain relevant.
This realization hardened Gilliman. He began issuing commands that would have been unthinkable even during the darkest days of the Indomitus Crusade. Entire chapters of Adeptus Astartes were reassigned without consultation, split apart to reinforce failing sectors or act as containment forces rather than instruments of conquest. Some protested, others obeyed without question. Those who hesitated found themselves isolated, their supply lines inexplicably delayed, their requests lost within administrative voids that had suddenly become hostile. The ecclesiarchy reacted in panic masked as revelation. Visions proliferated among the faithful, conflicting prophecies tearing at the unity of belief that had sustained the Imperium's spiritual cohesion. Shrines became battlegrounds of doctrine. The emperor allowed this fracture to spread, observing which interpretations stabilized communities and which incited collapse. Faith was no longer sacred, it was data. In the warp, this recalibration registered as dissonance. Humanity's psychic signature shifted again, not in magnitude, but in coherence. Billions still believed, still prayed, but belief no longer flowed toward a single suffocating image of divine stasis. It diversified, adapted, fractured along survivable lines. The ruinous powers fed on extremes. Moderation starved them. The emperor noted the effect with cold approval. Elsewhere, dormant assets awakened. Across forgotten systems, hidden installations powered up at his silent prompting. Shipyards sealed since the Age of Strife resumed construction using templates erased from imperial memory. Not innovation, restoration. Designs created when humanity had still planned for dominance rather than endurance. Crews assigned to these sites were selected not for loyalty, but for cognitive resilience, their minds less prone to warp resonance and doctrinal rigidity. The Adeptus Custodes expanded their role beyond Terra for the first time in millennia. Small, precise deployments began appearing at flashpoints, too volatile for conventional forces. They did not conquer, they corrected, replacing commanders, neutralizing threats, securing artifacts, then vanishing without explanation. Rumors spread of golden warriors acting without orders, without heraldry, answering only to a will no one could name. The Imperium whispered of judgment moving unseen. The emperor felt the strain increase. Every alteration demanded focus. Every deviation from inertia consumed precious endurance. The throne groaned louder now, its machinery pushed closer to thresholds no one alive fully understood. He adjusted again, redistributing his attention, prioritizing leverage over coverage. He would not save everything. That illusion had died with the Great Crusade. He would save what mattered. In distant darkness, powers beyond the Imperium began to recalculate their own strategies. Xenos empires delayed expansions. Warp entities circled cautiously. The galaxy sensed that humanity's stagnation had ended, replaced by something leaner and far more dangerous. The Imperium was not being unified. It was being rewritten under pressure. And the emperor watched closely to see which parts of his species deserved to endure the next age.
Resistance emerged where tradition had long mistaken itself for permanence. Planetary governors who had ruled for generations found their authority eroding overnight as supply convoys failed to arrive, and astropathic channels returned only silence. Forge worlds accustomed to autonomy discovered their data crypts subtly altered, sacred schematics reclassified without petition or prayer. None could identify the source of these changes, only their effect. The Imperium had begun to correct itself in ways that punished rigidity above all else. The emperor observed these reactions with clinical detachment. He had once believed humanity could be guided through enlightenment, lifted above superstition by force of reason and example. That hope had died screaming during the heresy. What remained was a species conditioned by catastrophe, capable of extraordinary resilience but addicted to myth. Awakening had not restored his optimism, it had refined his understanding. Humanity did not need truth, it needed survivable lies, temporary structures strong enough to endure until truth could no longer destroy it. Guilliman encountered this resistance directly. On a bastion world guarding a vital junction between Segmentum Solar and the scarred reaches beyond the rift, a conclave of Imperial commanders refused compliance with his revised operational doctrine. They cited tradition, honor, and the sanctity of established chains of command. Guilliman listened without interruption, then issued a single countermand that bypassed them entirely. Within days, their forces were reassigned, their authority hollowed out, their relevance erased without execution or spectacle. The lesson spread quickly. Compliance became less about obedience and more about adaptation. Those who adjusted their thinking found themselves reinforced, resupplied, and quietly elevated. Those who clung to precedent were left to face threats without support, their inevitable destruction serving as cautionary example. The Imperium had always consumed its failures, now it learned from them as well. Within the ecclesiarchy, fractures deepened into schism. Entire pilgrim routes collapsed as psychic pressure destabilized long sanctified corridors through the warp. Some cardinals interpreted this as divine punishment and intensified repression. Others shifted doctrine, preaching a faith of endurance rather than martyrdom. The emperor did not intervene. He watched which beliefs preserved population stability and which sparked self-destruction. Faith that killed faster than the enemy was no longer tolerable. In the immaterium, this evolution had measurable consequences. Warp entities accustomed to feeding on despair encountered resistance not through wards or banishment, but through absence. Fear did not vanish, it became controlled. Worlds adapted to constant threat developed psychic profiles less volatile, less nourishing to predatory intelligences. Chaos did not weaken uniformly. It became uneven, unpredictable, forced to hunt selectively rather than gorge freely. The Emperor noted this shift with approval. He redirected attention toward the Adeptus Astartes, his most enduring mistake and greatest asset. The legions had been broken into chapters to prevent another Horus. Over millennia, those chapters had drifted into isolation, mythologizing their own origins until purpose blurred into ritual. Guilliman's Primaris reforms had begun the correction. The Emperor accelerated it. Not through command, through pressure. Gene forges received subtle alterations embedded within sanctioned updates. Training doctrines evolved quietly, emphasizing adaptability over tradition-bound valor. Chapters that integrated these changes thrived, their operational efficiency increasing despite mounting galactic pressure. Those who resisted found themselves outpaced, their heroic last stands tragically impressive and strategically irrelevant. The Custodes observed these outcomes without emotion. Their own role expanded further, not as conquerors, but as arbiters of trajectory. They intervened only when deviation threatened systemic collapse, removing obstacles with surgical finality. The Emperor trusted them not because they were incorruptible, but because they understood restraint. Power wielded without limitation had broken the galaxy once already. Within the throne, the strain deepened. Each recalibration exacted a toll the throne could only partially offset. The Emperor felt portions of his awareness dim as resources were diverted to sustain ongoing manipulation. He accepted the loss. Perfect oversight was not necessary. Momentum now carried much of the burden. Systems were adapting independently, guided by initial conditions he had set in motion. That autonomy was intentional. A galaxy that required his constant attention was already lost. Far beyond imperial borders, distant observers reached the same conclusion through very different means. Expansion slowed, probing attacks withdrew, ancient empires revised threat assessments written before humanity's rise. The species, once dismissed as short-lived and self-destructive, had become volatile again in a way that demanded caution. The Emperor allowed himself a moment of stillness, not rest, reflection.
The Imperium was shedding its excess, not cleanly, not humanely, but effectively. Awakening had not restored what was lost, it had clarified what must be abandoned. The coming age would not be kind, but kindness had never ensured survival. As the second phase of correction took hold, the Emperor turned his attention toward threats no reform could blunt alone. Some wars could not be avoided, they could only be prepared for.
Preparation demanded revelation, but never all at once. The Emperor began to loosen seals that had remained untouched since before the Imperium learned to fear its own past. Knowledge once deemed too destabilizing now became necessary, parceled out in fragments small enough to be absorbed without collapse. Select forge worlds received encrypted awakenings buried within machine rituals, patterns that corrected inefficiencies without announcing their origin. Ancient equations resurfaced as devotional cant, their meaning obscured, yet their function precise. The Adeptus Mechanicus resisted instinctively. To them, knowledge was sanctity, and sanctity was control. Yet even Mars could not deny the results. Reactors stabilized under loads that should have annihilated them. Void shields adapted dynamically rather than rigidly. Machine spirits, never sentient, merely complex behavioral systems, responded with a clarity long thought lost. The Emperor did not challenge the cult Mechanicus directly, he simply demonstrated superiority through outcome. Those who understood adjusted their theology. Those who did not were quietly replaced. Guilliman oversaw this transition with a growing sense of unease. He recognized the pattern from ancient campaigns when his father moved beyond persuasion and into inevitability. Guilliman served as the visible hand of reform, issuing decrees and enforcing compliance, yet he knew the true changes flowed beneath him, too deep for even a Primarch to fully map. He was not offended by this, he was relieved. The burden of omniscience had never been his to bear. Across the segmenta, war doctrines evolved. Battles were no longer fought for symbolism or vengeance. Strategic withdrawal became acceptable again. Entire fronts were abandoned when their defense no longer justified the cost. Imperial commanders accustomed to martyrdom struggled with this recalibration, but those who adapted survived longer and learned faster. Victory was redefined as persistence, not domination. This shift starved chaos further. Despair still existed, but it was no longer theatrical. Fear became muted, focused inward rather than broadcast into the warp. Demonic incursions encountered resistance shaped by preparation rather than panic. Wards held longer, countermeasures activated earlier, cult uprisings collapsed before they could metastasize into planetary catastrophes. The ruinous powers responded with subtlety of their own. Corruption grew quieter, more insidious. Influence spread through patience rather than spectacle. The Emperor noted this evolution without concern. Chaos adapting was expected. Chaos improving was inevitable. What mattered was that it was no longer dictating the rhythm of the war. Attention turned toward the edges of imperial space. There were regions where correction alone would never suffice, zones where the warp's saturation exceeded safe thresholds, where reality itself had learned instability. The Emperor authorized operations not meant to reclaim, but to contain. Entire systems were isolated behind layered null fields and interdiction arrays, their fates sealed without announcement. The Imperium would not waste strength on wounds that could not yet be healed. These decisions echoed painfully through Guilliman's command councils. He signed orders that condemned billions without hesitation, then spent long hours alone reviewing casualty projections he could no longer afford to feel. He understood now why his father had grown distant during the Great Crusade. Compassion scaled poorly to empire. Survival scaled effortlessly.
Within the Golden Throne, the Emperor endured the cumulative toll. Awakening had granted clarity, not restoration. Portions of his awareness dimmed permanently as effort exceeded capacity. He compensated by relinquishing oversight where momentum was sufficient, trusting the systems he had reshaped to persist without constant correction. This was not weakness, it was sustainability. The galaxy began to reflect that principle. Imperial worlds stabilized into harsher, leaner forms of order. Xenos incursions met firmer resistance. Warp phenomena became less volatile, not fewer, but more predictable. For the first time in 10 millennia, humanity was not merely surviving the age it inhabited, it was beginning to shape it. The Emperor allowed that realization to settle. The Imperium was no longer a decaying monument to a failed dream. It was becoming an instrument again, imperfect, brutal, but functional. What followed would demand more than reform. It would demand confrontation on a scale that could not be softened or delayed. As the second chapter of this new era closed, the Emperor fixed his attention on the distant gathering pressures beyond even chaos's dominion. The galaxy was aligning itself for something vast, and humanity would either be ready or it would finally be erased.
The galaxy did not pause to witness the Emperor's designs. It continued, reckless and indifferent, as though the war-torn cosmos itself refused to acknowledge that its greatest architect had returned. Entire sectors seethed with unrest, old alliances frayed, and the scars of the Horus heresy pulsed like festering wounds across the stars. Yet beneath the tumult, invisible currents shifted. Every action, every rebellion, every stray fleet that attempted to carve its own path was nudged, corrected, or contained by a will it could neither see nor resist. The great rift, that yawning wound of chaos and void, throbbed in response to his presence. Warp storms churned violently along its edges, but they bent subtly under the Emperor's gaze, like waves curling around an unseen stone. Demons, sensing the reinforcement of mortal order, recoiled from the currents, their forms fragmenting into impossible geometry, leaving only echoes of terror in their wake. The Emperor's awakening had introduced not mere control, but a new kind of inevitability, an architecture of fate imposed from a single, unyielding mind. Gilliman felt it immediately. The Primarch could no longer see the galaxy as a collection of provinces and fleets. He saw it as a network of pressure points, each decision branching into consequences measured with cold precision. He could not intervene without guidance, yet he was already executing it. The Emperor's will acted through him, shaping fleets, armies, and populations without ever touching them directly. Every adjustment was surgical, merciless, and perfectly timed. In the void between Terra and the Rift, the Adeptus Astartes moved like living instruments of inevitability. Chapters long isolated and tested for stubbornness found themselves redeployed to critical junctures, operating not with honor or glory in mind, but with precision and adaptability. Some resisted at first, misinterpreting the subtle realignments as arbitrary interference. They learned quickly that resistance now meant annihilation. Adaptation, however, meant survival, and even triumph in ways their doctrines could barely accommodate. Chaos began to stir differently, no longer feeding freely upon fear and desperation. It was forced to adapt, its demonic tides channeling through narrow corridors, carefully prepared to absorb, deflect, or scatter them. Even the most cunning lords of the warp discovered their plans unraveling, thwarted not by armies or sorcery, but by a subtle, pervasive pressure that could not be confronted directly. They sensed a mind awake, not merely present, but weaving strategy across scales unimaginable to any mortal or god.
On worlds close to the rift, the population did not recognize the Emperor's influence directly, yet famine, pestilence, and rebellion were subtly mitigated. Starports that had once been ground zero for conflict became channels of efficient supply and coordination. Cities rebuilt in defiance of siege, not by miracles, but by unseen calculations that ensured the right resources appeared at the right time. Humanity began to adapt again, guided by a will that was invisible yet omnipresent. Within Terra's palace, the custodes observed patterns emerging that had long been ignored. They recorded anomalies, noting which systems stabilized under pressure and which faltered, all under the Emperor's silent scrutiny. They no longer acted simply as guards. They became interpreters of his intention, executing correction where the throne could not reach. Each act was measured, each intervention a proof of principle. The Imperium could survive if it learned, if it adapted, and if it obeyed the logic embedded into its own structure. And then the Emperor paused. Not because he had finished, but because the galaxy itself required observation. Every calculation, every deployment, every suppressed uprising and reinforced frontier had created ripples that now required assessment. Even the smallest adjustment could cascade unpredictably through centuries of accumulated error, superstition, and trauma. Patience became a weapon, as sharp and precise as any blade. Through it, he measured, judged, and prepared. The Emperor had awakened, yes, but awakening was not action, it was calculation. The galaxy had begun to move according to his will, but he had yet to unleash the full extent of what 1,000 centuries of foresight could achieve. The stage was set, the pieces in place, and the shadows of the rift whispered of battles yet to come, battles that would not be fought for survival alone, but for the very soul of reality itself. The Emperor's attention shifted outward toward the fringes of imperial space where disorder festered unchecked. Systems abandoned during centuries of war now teetered on the edge of collapse. Rogue governors, Xenos opportunists, and cults of despair thrived in these gaps, believing themselves beyond the reach of Terra. They were not beyond him. No corner of the galaxy could hide from a mind that had once measured the rise and fall of civilizations before the Horus Heresy. He did not move directly. That had never been his method. Intervention came in calculated whispers of influence, subtle shifts that redirected entire fleets or sabotaged nefarious schemes without a trace of his presence. Worlds realigned their defenses instinctively, supply chains flowed as if guided by unseen hands, and commanders adjusted strategies in ways that felt like instinct, but were born of his will. He had become the pulse beneath the Imperium, the hidden rhythm to which life and death conformed. Guilliman felt the weight of this subtlety keenly. Decisions that once required councils, debate, or deliberation were now resolved instinctively, as though 1,000 voices had aligned in perfect harmony. He could no longer separate his own judgment from the guidance flowing from the Golden Throne. Each command carried with it the imprint of the Emperor's will, an invisible hand bending reality without ever touching it. Adaptation had become survival, and survival had become obedience, not through fear, but through inevitability. Even chaos noticed the shift. Demonic currents recoiled from previously unassailable zones. Warp entities that had feasted on centuries of human despair found themselves constrained, funneled into narrow pathways, denied the sustenance of disorder. The ruinous powers tested their influence in subtle ways, probing for weaknesses, but the Emperor anticipated these incursions with cold precision. For the first time in 10 millennia, the galaxy's predators found themselves responding rather than dictating. The rules had changed. Within the Imperium, fear and awe intermingled. The Adeptus Astartes moved with unprecedented flexibility, adapting their training to shifting battle conditions that seemed impossible to predict. Entire chapters that resisted earlier reforms now found themselves overwhelmed not by enemy fire, but by circumstance and the invisible nudges of a mind that had awakened across time. Compliance was not enforced, it was engineered. Survival favored those who could evolve without being told. Those who could not were quietly excised from strategic consideration, their destruction an unremarked consequence of a larger pattern. The ecclesiarchy strained against the invisible tide. Preachers and prophets argued among themselves, their doctrines fracturing as they sought to explain miracles they could neither see nor name. Some saw the emperor's awakening as divine judgment, others as a test of faith, while a few whispered that the throne itself had become a conduit for a will older and colder than any god. He allowed these fractures to exist, studying their effects as though watching a laboratory experiment unfold over light years. In the warp, tension built like a coiled spring. Chaos attempted to assert influence through subtler manipulations, sowing seeds of doubt, corruption, and sedition. But every action had already been anticipated, accounted for, and rerouted by the Emperor's ever-present awareness. Cult uprisings collapsed before they could grow, rogue psychers were neutralized quietly, and entire fleets were diverted before disaster could strike. The Emperor's method was neither omnipotent nor infallible. It was inexorable. He had awakened to save humanity, but not by indulgence. Every adjustment exacted a toll upon the throne, each psychic exertion a physical agony that radiated through flesh and machine alike. Yet he endured, as he had 10,000 years before. Where once the Imperium had been reactive, now it moved as though breathing with a singular rhythm, each planet, fleet, and regiment synchronized into a pattern that could survive the worst the galaxy could throw at it. Guilliman understood the lesson fully now. Leadership was no longer the act of issuing orders, it was the orchestration of conditions, the alignment of forces to natural consequences, the subtle redirection of outcomes long before crisis arrived. Survival demanded adaptation, obedience through instinct, and the recognition that the galaxy no longer operated on human timescales alone. The Primarch's duty was no longer command, it was alignment. And he did so with a mixture of awe, fear, and devotion. And as the Emperor's will radiated outward like a psychic tide, the shadow of the rift pulsed in response, an echo of chaos restrained, a warning of battles yet to come, and the promise of a galaxy reshaped according to the vision of its ultimate master. The galaxy was becoming a crucible. Every sector, every fleet, every planetary governor and chapter of Astartes was being tested under conditions the Emperor had crafted with surgical precision. His presence did not announce itself in triumphal gestures or miraculous displays. It was subtler, insidious, like gravity bending trajectories over vast distances. Entire systems adapted without realizing they had been reshaped. Worlds that had long been abandoned were nudged back into viability. Fleets that had once been isolated now moved with uncanny synchronicity. The Emperor did not command, he calibrated. Guilliman observed, guided by the invisible currents of his father's will. He understood now that every decision he made was simultaneously autonomous and imposed, part of a plan that spanned centuries. The weight of it pressed against him, yet he bore it as a necessary discipline. The Indomitus Crusade no longer existed merely to reclaim lost territory. It was a vector, a mechanism to realign the Imperium to survive. Every deployment was a test, every skirmish a proof of viability. Failures were noted, corrected, and accounted for, not with emotion, but with ruthless calculation. The warp itself began to conform to this new order. Demonic incursions became predictable, constrained, and ultimately avoidable. Where chaos had once imposed madness and despair, it now found resistance built into the very fabric of the galaxy. Prophets who once stirred rebellion were subtly redirected, their influence nullified by networks of psychic pressure too diffuse to attack directly, yet too precise to evade. Entire cults collapsed internally, their doctrines unraveling before the first physical strike could reach them. The Emperor's awakening had created a filter through which only adaptation could pass. On Terra, the custodes executed unseen interventions. Vaults long sealed were reopened with surgical timing, hidden arsenals reactivated, and personnel placed in positions that ensured survival without disrupting the larger pattern. They acted not as rulers or enforcers, but as extensions of the Emperor's will, correcting deviations and reinforcing stability wherever necessary. Even the High Lords of Terra, accustomed to absolute authority, felt their relevance erode as their decisions became secondary to invisible forces acting across the Imperium. The ecclesiarchy fractured further. Pilgrimages diverted, doctrinal disputes erupted with sudden intensity. Faith, once a stabilizing force, became a test of resilience. Belief was no longer blindly rewarded, it was observed, measured, and integrated into the calculus of survival. Those who adapted thrived, and those who clung to dogma were left exposed, their influence quietly excised. The Imperium was learning, painfully, inexorably, that survival demanded evolution. Even beyond the Imperium, the ripples were felt. Exo-Xenos races recalculated their strategies, sensing an imperceptible force guiding human movements. Eldar seers could not predict outcomes, only sense the pressure shaping events. The Necrons, long indifferent, recognized patterns that aligned too neatly with an intelligence beyond their comprehension. The ruinous powers, for all their cunning, found themselves constrained, their influence diluted by subtle, omnipresent oversight. The galaxy itself was bending to a mind that had endured 10 millennia of suffering and strategy, a mind that now moved not with haste, but with inevitability. The Emperor considered the next step. He could act overtly and the galaxy would tremble. He could enforce his will directly and worlds would burn in awe. Yet he chose another path. Subtlety, calibration, patience, these were tools more powerful than armies or psychers. The Imperium would endure because it was being guided to endure, shaped by invisible hands that ensured adaptation at every level. The awakening was not a display. It was preparation for a war that would eclipse memory, for challenges that even gods dared not name aloud. And Galiman, standing at the nexus of strategy and execution, understood the weight of what had begun. The Emperor was awake. The galaxy was being tested, and those who survived would be remade in the image of endurance itself.
The galaxy did not pause. It never paused. Even as the Emperor's awareness stretched across light years, threading through the warp and the material, the relentless pulse of existence continued. Civilizations rose and fell, wars flared, and the devouring hunger of the ruinous powers persisted. Yet, now, every motion of life, every surge of conflict met an invisible counterweight, a subtle pressure guiding outcomes with surgical precision. The Emperor did not intervene directly. He orchestrated consequence. He planted inevitability. On worlds closest to Terra, the effect was almost tangible. Cities rebuilt themselves under siege without apparent coordination. Fleets rerouted not by orders, but by subtle shifts in resource flows, signals, and morale. Entire planetary populations adapted without understanding why. Systems long thought lost responded to threats with instinctive coherence. Even the smallest administrative adjustment echoed across thousands of kilometers, subtly correcting mistakes, punishing stubbornness, rewarding flexibility. Humanity was learning again, not through guidance, but through adaptation imposed by the weight of a will they could not see. Gilliman monitored this silent symphony with awe and dread. The Primarch felt the scale of the calculation, the precision of intent. He understood now that even his own decisions were instruments in a larger mechanism.
Every redeployment he authorized, every world he reinforced or abandoned, aligned with invisible vectors of cause and effect that only the Emperor comprehended fully. Adaptation had become mandatory, obedience automatic, and survival a function of intelligence, flexibility, and timing. Beyond the Imperium, the effects radiated outward like ripples across dark water. Eldar seers felt the collapse of predictive webs. Xenos fleets altered course inexplicably. Necron tomb worlds stirred, sensing a pattern they could not decipher. And in the warp, chaos reeled, forced to recalibrate strategies, abandon plans, and digest the new calculus of human persistence. Demonic tides that had once surged freely now collided with barriers they could not anticipate, funneling them into corridors and traps that the Emperor had not created directly but had allowed to manifest through careful orchestration of cause and effect. The galaxy itself had become a chessboard, and every piece moved under unseen pressure. On Terra, the custodes acted as his extensions. They intervened only where correction demanded it. Ancient vaults opened in precise sequences. Weaponry long sealed was reactivated at critical junctures. Personnel placements were adjusted with microscopic accuracy. They did not conquer, they did not dominate, they corrected. Each act reinforced the invisible hand of the Emperor's will, ensuring that the Imperium, fractured and overextended, could endure the storms approaching from every side. The custodes, for the first time in millennia, had become less guards and more agents of inevitability. Even the ecclesiarchy felt the change, though none could articulate its cause. Doctrines fractured, pilgrimages rerouted, and preachers lost certainty. Faith became an instrument, measured and evaluated for its ability to stabilize populations rather than inspire blind devotion. The Emperor allowed the fragmentation to continue, observing the outcomes as though watching a vast experiment unfold across countless worlds. Those communities that adapted survived, those that clung to superstition unraveled. Survival, like all else, was now determined by compatibility with inevitability. Guilliman absorbed the magnitude of what was occurring. The Primarch's guidance was no longer tactical alone, it was philosophical. The Emperor's awakening demanded not obedience, but assimilation. Every sector had to think, respond, and evolve in ways aligned with invisible vectors he could barely perceive. To resist was to fail. To conform without understanding was to survive. The galaxy's course now was a living algorithm, and he, Guilliman, was both a steward and a participant in its ongoing calculation. And yet, for all this orchestration, one immutable truth persisted. The Emperor had awakened not to comfort humanity, not to restore a golden age. He had awakened to prepare it for the inevitable collision with forces so vast, so ancient, and so merciless that survival would demand transformation, endurance, and the subtle perfection of adaptation. The Imperium would endure, yes, but only if it embraced the unforgiving logic of inevitability imposed from the throne. The stars themselves seemed to lean closer, listening. The future had begun to shift. The Emperor's awareness stretched further into regions long abandoned, forgotten by both the Imperium and its enemies. He did not move there in fleets or armies. He moved in influence, subtle, pervasive, and unstoppable. Systems teetering on collapse were guided back from the brink without a single visible intervention. Supply convoys rerouted instinctively, defenses strengthened in anticipation of attacks never formally predicted, and populations adapted to chaos as though it were natural order. Humanity was learning, not by guidance, but by necessity imposed from a will they could not see or question. Gilliman felt the weight of this omnipresent supervision acutely. Every decision he made, every maneuver, every assignment, every judgment carried the imprint of the Emperor's intent. He was executing, yes, but execution was inseparable from orchestration. The Primarch understood that mistakes now carried consequences far beyond immediate loss. Each error resonated across sectors, exposing weaknesses, triggering adaptations, and reinforcing patterns designed by the mind that had never truly slept. Adaptation had become survival, and survival demanded instinctive compliance. The Adeptus Astartes, long conditioned by doctrine and ritual, found themselves reshaped without realizing it. Chapters that resisted change faltered in engagements against foes they had once mastered. Chapters that embraced subtle modifications in strategy, structure, and mobility thrived. It was not command that determined success, but flexibility. The Emperor's will acted as an invisible teacher, rewarding resilience, punishing rigidity, and demonstrating that evolution, not valor, determined survival. Beyond imperial borders, the effects rippled unpredictably. Eldar seers could not anticipate the paths of the Imperium's fleets. Xenos civilizations recalculated expansion and diplomacy as unseen forces redirected human actions. The Necrons, sensing patterns of coordination that defied logic, awakened tomb worlds prematurely, reassessing long-dormant contingencies. Chaos, ever opportunistic, discovered that its manipulations were subtly neutralized. Demonic tides found themselves corralled, diverted, or consumed by invisible boundaries set by a mind that had awakened to shape outcomes rather than fight battles. On Terra, the Custodes acted with renewed purpose. Their interventions were precise, minimal, and effective. Vaults that had remained untouched for millennia opened in sequence, arming worlds and fleets at the precise moment they were required. Strategic deployments executed without explanation reinforced stability, and even the High Lords felt the erosion of their absolute authority, as invisible adjustments rendered their deliberations secondary. The Imperium was being guided, not ruled, and the Custodes ensured subtle guidance became lasting result. Within the warp, chaos reeled under constraint. The Emperor's psychic pressure filtered corruption and despair, transforming them from omnipresent threats into manageable variables. Rogue psychers, insurgent cults, and demonic infiltrators found their influence diminishing. Where chaos once dictated the tempo of human suffering, it now reacted to the parameters the Emperor imposed. The ruinous powers had never faced a predator that did not strike, yet consumed everything in planning. They had never contended with inevitability. Even faith itself was tested. The ecclesiarchy fractured in response to invisible pressures. Preachers questioned tradition, doctrines collided, pilgrimages dissolved or shifted with no explanation. The Emperor did not act to unify or reconcile. He allowed the fractures to exist, watching as belief itself became a tool for stability rather than chaos. Those who adapted to the new framework thrived, while those clinging to dogma faltered quietly. Humanity was no longer guided by faith alone. It was guided by consequence, structure, and the subtle shaping of will. Gilliman, ever vigilant, absorbed the lesson fully. Leadership had become orchestration. Command was no longer about orders or enforcement. It was alignment, adaptation, and precise correction. The galaxy itself had become a living mechanism, responding to pressures it did not recognize. Errors were corrected silently, success rewarded with reinforcement, and all was measured against the inexorable logic of survival. The Primarch understood that the awakening had not restored the past. It had rewritten the future. and the emperor, seated upon the golden throne, observed the unfolding pattern. The Imperium had begun to endure in ways no one alive could have predicted. The great rift's fury, the predations of chaos, the ambitions of alien empires, all were becoming secondary to the silent, pervasive will of the master of mankind. Humanity's resilience was being sculpted, honed, and tested. Survival was no longer a hope. It had become inevitable.
The emperor's focus extended outward, beyond the edges of imperial space, into sectors where lawlessness and decay had long ruled. He did not move fleets personally, nor issue proclamations from Terra. His influence was quieter, subtler, yet infinitely more effective. Supply chains rerouted without explanation, planetary defenses adapted as though anticipating every assault, and populations instinctively modified behavior in response to threats they did not understand. Survival became a function of adaptation, a principle imposed across the galaxy with quiet precision. Guilliman felt the weight of the Emperor's presence in every decision he executed. Every redeployment, every reassignment, every calculated abandonment of a world carried unseen guidance. The Primarch realized that outcomes were no longer determined by bravery, tradition, or even strategy alone. They were determined by the alignment of countless variables, all nudged, corrected, and measured by a will that had awakened beyond time. He acted not as commander, but as instrument, translating invisible vectors into tangible reality. Across the Imperium, the Adeptus Astartes evolved unconsciously. Chapters that resisted the subtle recalibrations found themselves faltering in engagements once routine. Chapters that adapted thrived, responding with an almost instinctive efficiency that surpassed their training. Success was no longer measured by valor or victory alone, but by the ability to survive, adjust, and continue functioning under the hidden guidance now shaping the galaxy. Adaptation, not honor, had become the measure of survival. Beyond the Imperium, the ripples of awakening spread. Xenos empires recalculated expansion, retreat, and diplomacy, sensing an intelligence manipulating events from beyond their comprehension. Eldar seers could no longer chart futures with confidence, their webs of foresight fraying under invisible pressure. Necron tomb worlds shifted, awakening prematurely to counter patterns they could not decipher. Even the ruinous powers found themselves constrained, their influence neutralized by an imperceptible order that guided human action before chaos could strike. The galaxy had become a system of inevitability, shaped by a mind that had endured 10 millennia of suffering and strategy. On Terra, the Custodes executed precise interventions. Vaults long untouched opened in sequence, arsenals and archives activated with surgical timing. Strategic placements of personnel and equipment ensured stabilization of critical points without revealing the underlying design. The High Lords of Terra, long accustomed to supreme authority, found their decisions increasingly irrelevant as invisible adjustments overtook deliberation. The Imperium was being guided without overt control, a living organism shaped to endure the storms of war. Within the warp, the effects were profound. Demonic forces found themselves channeled, funneled, and contained. Rogue psychers and cults were neutralized before gaining traction. Chaos could no longer manipulate outcomes freely. It reacted instead, forced to adapt to boundaries it could not overcome. The Emperor's awakening had created a new equilibrium in which disorder could not dictate the terms of conflict. Predictability returned to unpredictability itself, and even gods found themselves calculating against forces beyond their reach. Faith itself became a measured instrument. The ecclesiarchy fractured, doctrines collided, and pilgrimages diverted as belief adjusted to the unseen pressures of survival. Communities that adapted endured, while those clinging to dogma disintegrated quietly.
Humanity's resilience was no longer maintained by faith alone, but by consequences, systems, and the invisible hand guiding adaptation. The Imperium was alive, learning, and enduring. Guilliman understood fully that leadership had transformed. Command was no longer about giving orders or enforcing rules. It was about alignment, adaptation, and precision correction. The galaxy had become a living mechanism, with error corrected silently, success reinforced subtly, and outcomes measured against the inevitability of survival. The Emperor had awakened not to restore what was lost, but to forge the Imperium into an instrument capable of enduring forces greater than it had ever faced. And so, as the stars watched silently, the Emperor remained upon the golden throne. The Imperium had begun to endure not by chance, not by divine miracle, but by the precise, invisible shaping of a mind that had awakened to orchestrate the fate of a galaxy. Survival was no longer hope, it was inevitable.
The awakening of the Emperor was no herald of triumph. It was the beginning of reckoning. Across the Imperium, subtle shifts rippled outward, changing the calculus of war, governance, and survival. Entire systems realigned themselves as though anticipating an unseen hand, while fleets moved with a synchrony that surpassed even the most disciplined admiral's expectations. Yet this was not guidance in the conventional sense. It was inevitability made tangible. Every adjustment precise, every outcome measured, every failure instructive. Guilliman perceived it with grim clarity. The Primarch could feel the weight of invisible forces flowing through his decisions. Every deployment he authorized, every planetary defense he reinforced, every abandonment he sanctioned was part of a larger pattern, one the Emperor had designed across centuries. Adaptation had become law, survival a function of obedience to the logic embedded in the galaxy itself. Even those unaware of the changes were influenced, nudged to evolve in accordance with imperceptible pressures. The galaxy was no longer reactive, it was being orchestrated to endure. On the edges of Imperial space, the consequences were already evident. Xenos forces, long accustomed to exploiting human weakness, found their maneuvers countered before they could gain traction. Eldar foresight faltered. Necron awakenings recalculated against outcomes they could not predict, and chaos discovered its manipulations neutralized by a tide of subtle corrections. The ruinous powers, for the first time, were forced to react rather than dictate. Humanity, long prey to cosmic forces, had become something new, a species guided by an intellect that did not sleep, that did not err, that calculated not for conquest or glory, but for survival and transformation. Even the ecclesiarchy, fractured and uncertain, could not escape observation. Preachers, prophets, and pilgrims acted according to invisible pressures. Belief became a tool of stability rather than chaos. Doctrine, a system for preserving life rather than enforcing dogma. Those who adapted thrived. Those who resisted quietly collapsed, their influence erased not by edict but by consequence. The Imperium was learning not by instruction, but by experience, and its survival depended on that lesson taking root in every sector, planet, and individual. Within Terra itself, the custodes operated as extensions of the throne. Vaults long dormant were activated in sequence, weaponry and technology deployed at the precise moment necessity demanded. Strategic personnel placements ensured stability across key worlds without revealing the Emperor's hand. Even the High Lords felt the subtle erosion of authority as invisible adjustments superseded deliberation. The Imperium, vast and overextended, was being steered without direct command, refined into a mechanism capable of withstanding forces that had once threatened to annihilate it. The warp itself shifted in response. Demonic tides found themselves channeled and contained, rogue psychers neutralized before their influence could spread, and chaos was compelled into containment rather than expansion.
The Emperor's awakening created a balance in which disorder could not dictate the tempo of the galaxy. The ruinous powers were constrained, their schemes subtly preempted, their dominance challenged not by brute force, but by inevitability. Humankind's resilience was no longer accidental, it was engineered. And the Emperor, enduring upon the golden throne, observed it all. The galaxy's vast complexity had been measured, weighed, and nudged toward sustainability. Every planetary rebellion, every fleet maneuver, every cultist uprising became data points integrated into a living system of adaptation and consequence. The Imperium was no longer merely surviving the age it inhabited. It was being remade, prepared for challenges that would exceed comprehension, and armed with the resilience to endure them. The future, silent yet inevitable, awaited. The Imperium had entered a new era, one defined not by open conquest, but by the subtle, inexorable hand of its master. Worlds long considered lost began to respond, populations stabilizing without apparent intervention, fleets adjusting their trajectories instinctively, and planetary defenses activating in synchrony with threats before a single order was issued. The Emperor's awakening had transformed the galaxy into a living mechanism, one in which adaptation was rewarded, rigidity punished, and survival was dictated by alignment with an invisible will. Gilliman moved within this lattice of inevitability with precision, aware that his every decision was both autonomous and constrained. Fleets he commanded executed maneuvers he had planned, yet the outcomes aligned with pressures he could neither fully see nor measure. Every planetary governor who resisted subtle recalibrations found themselves isolated or deprived of resources, while those who adapted prospered silently. The Primarch understood. The Imperium was learning again, not through guidance, but through the invisible scaffolding imposed by a mind that had awakened beyond time. The Adeptus Astartes became instruments of this new order. Chapters that adjusted instinctively to evolving circumstances thrived, demonstrating flexibility that transcended even the most rigorous training. Chapters that clung to doctrine found themselves faltering, their victories Pyrrhic, and their losses quietly absorbed into the larger calculus of survival. Valor alone no longer ensured continuity. Adaptation, responsiveness, and resilience had become the measure of effectiveness. The Emperor had engineered a system in which evolution was not optional, it was survival. Beyond human space, the cosmos sensed change. Xenos races recalculated their strategies as they encountered responses they could not predict. Eldar seers faltered, unable to anticipate trajectories governed by invisible forces. Necron tomb worlds awakened prematurely, reacting to patterns too subtle for comprehension. Even chaos discovered that its manipulations were neutralized, its demonic tides funneled into channels that reduced their potency. Humanity, once prey, now moved with the precision of an organism guided by a will as vast and enduring as the stars themselves. Faith and belief, too, were tested and reshaped. The ecclesiarchy fractured under pressure, doctrines clashed, and pilgrimages shifted without explanation. Communities that adapted endured, communities that resisted quietly collapsed. Belief was no longer simply a matter of devotion, it had become a metric of resilience. The Emperor observed silently, allowing adaptation to prove itself, letting the Imperium learn survival through experience, not dogma. The galaxy was evolving under pressure, and every adaptation strengthened the foundation of endurance. On Terra, the Custodes continued their silent work. Vaults and arsenals long dormant were activated with perfect timing. Personnel were repositioned to reinforce strategic locations. Even the High Lords of Terra, masters of the Imperium for millennia, found their authority subtly undermined as unseen adjustments guided outcomes before deliberation could occur. The Imperium was no longer directed by decree alone. It was orchestrated through precision, consequence, and inevitability, and everywhere the Custodes acted, stability returned. The warp itself acknowledged the shift. Demonic forces found themselves constrained. Rogue psychers and cults were neutralized before their influence could spread. Chaos could no longer dictate the tempo of human suffering. The Emperor's awakening had engineered resilience into the very fabric of the galaxy, shaping it to endure. The ruinous powers were forced to react, their dominance challenged not by confrontation, but by inevitability itself. And in the Golden Throne, the Emperor observed. Every rebellion, every fleet maneuver, every planetary disaster became data points in a grand system of adaptation. The Imperium was not merely surviving, it was being remade, sharpened, and fortified. Survival was no longer hope, it was inevitable. The reckoning of stars had begun.
The galaxy's tapestry was shifting under an invisible hand. Worlds long mired in chaos now moved with silent precision. Fleets redeployed as if aware of unseen currents. Planetary governors and imperial commanders adapted instinctively, responding to crises before they fully emerged. The Emperor's awakening had not delivered spectacle, nor did it rely on displays of power. It operated on inevitability, subtle adjustments across time and space that ensured survival, reshaped behavior, and refined the Imperium into a machine of enduring resilience. Gilliman felt the full weight of this orchestration. His authority remained, but it had transformed. Decisions were executed not solely through command, but through alignment with a system far larger than comprehension. Every redeployment, every strategic adjustment, every measured abandonment of territory contributed to an invisible algorithm of survival. Even resistance was anticipated, and adaptation rewarded with efficiency that bordered on preternatural. The Primarch understood humanity's endurance no longer depended on bravery alone. It depended on evolution, responsiveness, and the alignment of will with the Emperor's awakened intent. The Adeptus Astartes embodied this transformation. Chapters that embraced adaptability thrived, responding to dynamic threats with instinctive efficiency that surpassed even their most rigorous training. Chapters clinging to rigid doctrine faltered, their actions increasingly irrelevant in the context of a galaxy guided by unseen forces. Valor was insufficient. Survival required fluidity, calculation, and responsiveness to patterns no human eye could discern. The Emperor had made evolution the currency of continuity. Across the galaxy, Xenos forces and Chaos alike felt the pressure. Eldar foresight faltered, unable to navigate patterns dictated by an unseen force. Necron tomb worlds shifted and awoke prematurely in reaction to imperceptible triggers. Chaos found its manipulations stymied, demonic incursions redirected into channels that limited their influence. Even the ruinous powers were forced to react rather than impose, their dominance challenged by a logic that did not tire, did not err, and did not forget. Humanity, once prey, now moved with the inevitability of an organism guided by a mind that had endured 10 millennia. Faith and doctrine continued to fracture, reshaping human resilience. The ecclesiarchy fractured under unseen pressures, doctrines clashed, pilgrimages shifted, and communities adapted to survive. Belief itself became an instrument for endurance rather than a source of chaos. The Emperor observed silently, allowing adaptation to prove its efficacy. Survival was measured in flexibility and alignment, not devotion alone. Humanity was learning, evolving, and surviving under pressures it could not perceive. On Terra, the custodes enacted surgical precision. Vaults and arsenals long dormant activated in exact sequence. Strategic redeployments ensured stability in critical locations without revealing the underlying mechanism. Even the High Lords of Terra found their authority subtly diminished as the Imperium responded to invisible adjustments faster than deliberation could occur. The galaxy was no longer simply governed, it was orchestrated.
In the warp, the balance shifted. Daimonic forces were constrained, rogue psychers neutralized, and chaos's manipulations diluted. The Emperor's awakening had reshaped the fundamental interaction between humanity and the ruinous powers. Disorder could no longer dictate the terms of survival. The galaxy itself had been aligned, engineered to endure. And upon the Golden Throne, the Emperor watched. Every rebellion, every maneuver, every disaster became a data point, integrated into a system that ensured persistence against impossible odds. The Imperium was no longer merely surviving, it was remade. The reckoning had begun, and survival was inevitable. The stars themselves seemed to acknowledge the awakening, bending subtly to a will older than time, preparing the galaxy for the trials that would determine not just survival, but the very destiny of mankind.